have looked at Exodus and Amos and Job, and now we are looking at Daniel. I'll say on the front end, I wish that we had a movie of the book of Daniel, and that the people who produced the Game of Thrones TV show were the ones in charge of it, because I would love to see chapter 7 of Daniel done by the same people who did the Game of Thrones. They could probably do some great beasts, what they did with the dragons and the beasts in Game of Thrones. Book of Daniel is an enigmatic book. It is set in the days of the Babylonian exile, which we were just talking about, where Nebuchadnezzar carried the Judean people into exile. It was likely written in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, much later than the time of the exile. So it was set in one era and most likely written in another era. Now, Stephen asked me to talk a little bit about the history of the development of the Hebrew language. I'm not an expert on that, but I can talk about it a little bit. One of the things that we'll see when we get into chapters 1 through 6 are some Greek loan words in the chapters. And it's unlikely you would have Greek loan words before the days of Alexander the Great, who spread the Greek language and culture all over the known world. So the book of Daniel is an enigmatic book. Half of the book consists of folk tales, chapters 1 through 6, set in the courts of a variety of kings. And then the other half of the book consists of apocalyptic visions. Apocalyptic meaning, apocalyptic in literature, like the book of Revelation, is a book where you get secret information from a dream or a vision. It deals with end times and with secrets that you cannot learn any other way. So the second half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, are these apocalyptic visions. Half of the book is written in Hebrew, and half of the book is written in Aramaic. It would make more sense if, say, the chapters 1 through 6 were written in Aramaic, and chapters 7 through 12 were written in Hebrew, but that's not the way it works. Chapter 1 is in Hebrew. The first 4 verses of chapter 2 are in Hebrew, and then it switches to Aramaic in verse 4 of chapter 2, so that the Hebrew and Aramaic don't line up. There have been a variety of explanations for why that might be, that perhaps the Hebrew part was written to appeal to patriotism of the people who read it, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So, it would make more sense if the Hebrew and Aramaic lined up, but they don't. So, in Daniel chapter 1, the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Now, if you know the story, you know what happens. Daniel and his 3 companions are separated out from the rest of the exiles. They are sent to school to learn Babylonian language and ways, and they are given new names. So Nebuchadnezzar's goal is to assimilate them and make them useful to him. Their goal is to maintain their identity. They are invited to eat the king's food, and they refuse. And the guard over them is worried that if they don't look healthy, the king will have his head. So Daniel says, well, let us eat nothing but vegetables and see how we do. And at the end of the time, they were healthier than everybody else. So the refusing to eat the king's food, it was not kosher. It was not that the food wasn't kosher. It was the idea that I'm not going to buy into the king's agenda. I'm going to maintain my own identity. I'm going to decide who I am. They went beyond any kind of kosher food laws. But it was the idea that we're not going to, the king isn't going to own us. So what chapter 1 does is introduce the characters and introduce the idea of living in a foreign court, a foreign land, and trying to maintain your identity. Trying to be who you want to be and not who the king forces you to be. Many scholars, and I have come around to this way of thinking too, believe that chapter 1 was probably the last chapter written of the book. It sets the tone and it introduces the characters. Now, we're about to go to Daniel 3. In Daniel 3, Daniel does not make an appearance. And the three friends don't show up any place but chapters 1 and chapter 3. Leading people to believe, leading scholars to believe that some of these stories circulated independently, and somebody gathered them up. And that the reason they gathered up chapter 3 and included it in the book was the idea of resistance. Because in a book named after Daniel, Daniel doesn't appear. So chapter 3, we're going to skip over chapter 2, interest of time. Nebuchadnezzar sets up a golden statue and tells everybody in the kingdom they have to bow down to it. Well, the three friends, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are their Babylonian names. Refuse to bow down. And so Nebuchadnezzar heats up a fiery furnace, throws them in, and they come out just fine. A couple of highlights. There's a group that tattles on them. And Nebuchadnezzar assembles this little band. And whenever you hear the band play, that's when you have to bow down to the statue. And that's one of the places where the Greek loanwords come in. The names of the instruments that they play in the band are Greek loanwords. So it means that one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar does is co-opt the arts. The arts should be free. The arts should be expressive. The arts should challenge power at times. But this is co-opting the arts. So the arts serve the interests of the king. So the king is furious that they will not bow down to the statue. There's an enigmatic verse. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, verse 17. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods. But if not is kind of an enigmatic phrase. A professor here at SMU, at Perkins, did research on this, and he thinks it means, but if you don't throw us in the fire, if you relent and don't throw us in the fire, we still won't serve you. Some people thought it meant if our God doesn't rescue us, but that doesn't make any sense, because if God doesn't rescue them, they'll be burned to a crisp. So anyway, they resist. The king throws them into the furnace for their resistance, and they come out just fine. So this continues the theme of resisting the assimilation into a foreign land, and demonstrates God's power over life and death. And that will play a major part when we get to the end of the book. So the theme of resistance, courage, and God's power over life and death. All right, chapter 6, this is a famous story of the lion's den. So Darius the Mede and history has no record of a king named Darius the Mede. So people have tried to figure out who Darius the Mede is. And likely he is a composite character invented for the story. History has no record of a king named Darius the Mede. So he sets up a bureaucracy to run his kingdom. And some sneaky people convince him that you shouldn't worship anybody but him. Daniel, of course, they know is going to worship his God. And when they catch him doing that, they report him to Darius, and Darius throws him in the lion's den. When artists have depicted chapter 6, they always depict what the author doesn't talk about, what actually happens in the lion's den. The author doesn't tell us anything about what happens in the lion's den. He does not describe that scene at all, but the artists go crazy with it. Sometimes the lions are docile, sit there and quiet. Sometimes they're snapping and snarling, but for some reason can't get to Daniel. So worship is an important theme in the book of Daniel. Whom do you worship? Nebuchadnezzar and Darius want worship themselves, and the Judean exiles will worship no one but their God. So Darius throws them in the lion's den, and they come out just fine the next morning. So again, the theme of resistance and the theme of God's power over life and death. So those are the court tales. Now, one of the questions about the book of Daniel is, why were the court tales that were written in the 3rd century put together with chapters 7 through 12? At least 2 through 6 were written probably in the 3rd century. 7 through 12 written in the 2nd century. Why were they put together 100 years apart? Who put them together and why? Likely the court tales had important ideas within them and the theme of resistance that the authors and editors of chapter 7 through 12 resonated with. So united the court tales and the visions. Now, in chapter 7, things really heat up. Daniel's role throughout the book of Daniel, through both the court tales and the apocalyptic visions, changes. In chapter 2, Daniel is the only one who can interpret the king's dream. In chapter 5, Daniel is the only one who can read the mysterious handwriting on the wall. We're all familiar with that phrase. Can you read the handwriting on? Can you read the writing on the wall? Daniel's the only one who can understand the writing on the wall. In chapter 7, starting in chapter 7, Daniel himself has visions. He doesn't interpret other people's visions. He has visions himself. So in chapter 7, things get very spooky. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea. This is why I say I wish the people who produced Game of Thrones could do a movie of the book of Daniel. I would love to see what they do with chapter 7. These 4 great beasts are rising out of the sea. In biblical thought, the sea is the home of demonic forces. In the Gospels, when there's a storm at sea, it's the demonic forces trying to kill Jesus. It's not just a regular storm. It's the demonic forces trying to kill Jesus. In the book of Revelation, when God restores everything, it says the sea is no more, meaning the home of the demons is gone. So these four great beasts arise out of the sea. They represent four kingdoms: Babylonian, the Median kingdom, Persian, and the Greek kingdom. This changes the equation. In chapters 1 through 6, the kings were just simply inept and cruel, unpredictable. Now they're the tools of these demonic beasts that arise, chaotic beasts or demonic beasts, evil beasts that arise out of the sea. This is a different kind of interpretation of these kings. So anyway, the four beasts are fearsome, gruesome in their appearance. They fight against each other, replace each other. So they have these four beasts arise up out of the sea. And now I'm in chapter 7, starting in verse 9. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. This is God, of course. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. So we're used to fire being a sign of God's presence, the burning bush for Exodus. Now, this fourth beast is the most important of the beasts. The fourth beast represents the Greek kingdom. And there's a little horn that comes up on the head of the fourth beast. This little horn is the Syrian king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Epiphanes means he thinks he was God manifest. He tries to use Greek culture and Greek language to unify the area that he controls, which included Palestine and Babylonia and the Jews. So now he would have come up after the people had returned. So the Jews have come back from Babylonia by the time Antiochus IV arises. Now the dream itself is that it's still set during the exile, but the events that happen are described after people have come back. So Antiochus tries to unify his realm by imposing Greek language and culture. He forbids things like keeping the Sabbath. He forces people to eat pork. If mothers circumcise their babies, he has the babies killed and tied around the mother's necks. So he is trying to squash Jewish practice. He wants everybody to be Greek. That's why, most likely, the chapters 1 through 6, even they were written, chapters 1 through 6 were written before the time of Antiochus. They were written before things really heated up with Antiochus. But they were written during a time when the Jews were trying to hold on to their identity. But then under Antiochus, is around 160s BCE. He was really trying to stamp out Judaism. He was really trying to crush it. And so the idea of resistance, of choosing your identity, of choosing who you were going to be, becomes most important. So in Daniel's dream, the ancient one, sometimes called the Ancient of Days, takes his throne. Fire all around, attendants. Chapter 7, verse 11. I watched them because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So God is powerful enough simply to destroy the Greek kingdom and Antiochus simply by holding judgment. It's not a battle. It's not a fight. God just does it. Verse 13 introduces an interesting character. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, sometimes called one like a son of man in earlier translations. One like a human being is less gender specific. Coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. So the Son of Man figure, the one like a human being figure, is a new idea in Hebrew thought. This is a person who holds some dominion in heaven but isn't God. He is a counterpart to the four beasts. Four beasts, of course, are animal-like, and this is a one like a human being, represents true humanity. The phrase one like a human being, the Son of Man figure, developed in the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it became, of course, one of the titles for Jesus, the Son of Man. But the idea in chapter 7 is that God can, within history, now transcending history, this all takes place up in heaven. But within history, God is going to defeat the Greek kingdom in Antiochus. Of course, Antiochus does die. He is killed. But all this can happen within history. So there's chapter 7, this apocalyptic vision. Now there's more to it than that. God sets up in all of the court tales, and then in chapter 7, God establishes an eternal kingdom. This is chapter 7, verse 27. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. So the people who had experienced one power over them after another, Babylonians, Persians, all like that, the Greeks, the idea would be you're going to have stability in an eternal kingdom, and God is going to trust you with power. All this was going to happen within history up through chapter 7. So that's kind of the heart of the book of Daniel, is chapter 7. This apocalyptic vision of the four kingdoms and God defeating the Greek kingdom and Antiochus. Starting in chapter 11 with verse 40. This is another vision of Daniel. And what you have in chapter 11 is a sort of condensed version of history of the Middle East, told in an apocalyptic vision. Starting in chapter 11, verse 40, that's when you get to Antiochus. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. The king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. He shall advance against countries and pass through like a flood. He shall come into the beautiful land, and tens of thousands shall fall victim. But Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites shall escape from his power. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and the riches of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow in his train. But reports from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him. Now, what this last part of the book of Daniel, this was written by a group of people who consider themselves the wise ones. And they're telling people to resist, to cling on to wisdom, to hold on to wisdom, hold on to the teachings, maintain your identity. Now, during this time, there was a thing called the Maccabean Revolt. Judas Maccabeus and his descendants and followers led an armed rebellion. And they actually did recapture Jerusalem and the temple and rededicated it. But to the authors of the book of Daniel, that's not what's really important. The political dimension is not that important. It's the spiritual dimension. Now, you can argue all you want to about which is more important, but for the author of the book of Daniel, editors of the book of Daniel, maintaining your identity, seeking wisdom, resisting is most important. Now, the part that we really want to talk about, this is chapter 12. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. Michael, of course, is an archangel in heaven. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. So the picture is there's this battle going on earth. There's a battle going on in heaven. Michael and his forces, his angelic forces, have been losing. That's why all of this is happening. This is the language of mythology. We unfortunately have taken the word mythology and distorted it. We usually think of mythology as something that just doesn't happen. It's not true. You'll read articles on like the 4 myths of investing your money or the 4 myths of losing weight, meaning something that's not true. Mythology is a way of writing that talks about the spiritual dimension of what we see in history. So the authors and editors of the book of Daniel, the troubles on earth have a heavenly counterpart. There's the battle going on in heaven with Michael and his forces and the Greek forces. Michael has been losing, and now Michael's going to make a rally. He's going to make a comeback. It's like a team that is behind to the fourth quarter and rallies and scores and wins. So Michael says, Michael shall arise. So this heavenly battle is going to start going God's way. Now, verse 2 of chapter 12 is the key verse for what we're discussing. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That is the one and only place in the entire Old Testament where the idea of resurrection from the dead is affirmed. What this is saying is those people who have resisted Antiochus and his attempts to squash Judaism will be raised to life and rewarded. The big question is exactly who's going to be raised. Is this everybody, or is this only people who either have cooperated with and some of the Jews cooperated with this. They went along with it. Some of the Judeans went along with this. They tried to have their foreskins sewn back on. Sounds like a very painful procedure to me. And so they cooperated with this Hellenization. So this is saying those people who did that are going to be raised to everlasting contempt. But the people who resisted, maintained their identity, will be raised to everlasting reward. This is the affirmation of the book of Daniel, of resurrection, meaning that the times that you've seen God defeated, where people who are faithful and they're punished, they're killed, they're tortured, this is God's vindication. Now, elsewhere in the Old Testament, the idea of there's no real understanding of life after death. I'm going to read to you from the Psalms. Psalm chapter 6, verse 5. No, verse 4. Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? This is very different from what we are used to seeing, say, in the book of Revelation, where in the resurrection, you have this big worship service where people of all nations, tongues, and languages are worshiping God. They're nonstop worship. In most of the Old Testament, there is no belief in any kind of life after death worth having. We're not really quite sure what people thought about Sheol. Some of the references to Sheol make it seem like you're alive, but you're not alive. I mean, it's a shadowy existence. It's certainly not something, a time where you feel connected to God, where you can worship, where you're in God's presence. So throughout most of the Old Testament, there's no affirmation of a life after death, of resurrection. Here in Daniel, for the one time, there's an affirmation of resurrection. Now, in the intertestamental period between the testaments, the idea developed and blossomed. In 2nd Maccabees, there's a graphic passage where these 7 brothers are resisting Antiochus, and he has them all slaughtered. But they die triumphantly, claiming God will raise us. So after Daniel, this idea of resurrection developed. We know from the New Testament that the Pharisees believed in resurrection, the Sadducees didn't. So it did not necessarily catch on all through Judaism, but among the Pharisees it did. In their intertestamental period, it grew. But for our purposes for this study, you see in Exodus the idea that God is in favor of freedom, and God will act in history, within history, to bring political freedom and other kinds of freedom. In Amos is the idea that God will punish you if you don't treat people right. If you don't bring economic justice, God will punish you within history. Then in the book of Daniel, when it appears that God's purposes are thwarted, is the affirmation of resurrection. After this life, God will raise you and will reward you and make things right. Of course, this idea is central to Christianity. Without the resurrection, we really have nothing to proclaim as far as Christians, because that is the central event of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, scholars debate. It was Psalm 6, starting with verse 4. Scholars debate whether or how this idea of resurrection came into the book of Daniel. Now, I am conservative enough that I think inspiration and revelation played a part of it. But the key question is, did resurrection come into Jewish thought, Hebrew thought, from outside, from Iranian religion, say? Or is it inherent in Jewish thought? In Hebrew thought, in the Old Testament thought? I think it's inherent within Hebrew thought. The idea, say, where the prophets would bring somebody back to life, where God took Enoch, he never died. Where Elijah just transported directly up to heaven. So, but again, see, these Enoch and Elijah stories, do they presuppose belief in life after death? It doesn't really say. It's never clear. Were they special people who got to go up to the heavenly realm? We don't really know. But within Daniel is this affirmation that everybody, or at least plants the seed that everybody will be raised. And that becomes then one of the answers to suffering. Yes, we suffer in this life, but in the resurrection, God will make things right. Which means that resurrection arose in Hebrew thought, not necessarily as a reward for being good, but as a vindication of God. That if you obey God and you suffer for it and you're killed for it in this life, God will be vindicated. So that is a quick look over 4 weeks of how God deals with suffering in the Old Testament. That God does act in history, but also that God can act beyond history, a new idea in Hebrew thought. Yeah, we don't have a lot of historical information about that. I know that that's what Antiochus did. It talks about it in First Maccabees, depending on how historically reliable First Maccabees is. But and there are historians who go back and forth about Antiochus and was he as bad as the Jews set him out to be and made him out to be? But that's a good question. What do you do if you're a parent of a child? Do you circumcise a child knowing that that means the child will be killed?
And then later rewarded with
a resurrection.
Yeah, everlasting.
I would say that Daniel's answer would be, yeah, you go ahead and circumcise a child, and that because the child will be raised to life.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are Christians in China, at least I've read, who face much the same debate, much the same issue. They maintain their identity even in the face of death, and then certainly martyrs within Christian history. I think the answer of Daniel would be, yes, you go ahead and circumcise your child, and if the child is killed, the child will be raised. Now, that happens in the court tales. That say the 3 young men are given new names by Nebuchadnezzar.
So they did not
voluntarily
change their names. They were
change their names. Nebuchadnezzar gave them the new names.
I got you. Okay, well that sure answers that question.
Mythology is a way of writing that talks about the spiritual side of life. Usually in mythology, there is a heavenly component to whatever happens on earth. So in Daniel 10, 11, and 12, there's a spiritual battle going on in heaven between Michael and his army and the army of the Greeks. So that heavenly component to what's going on earth is a component to that genre of mythology. And there's a good bit of that in the Old Testament. And I don't think that should scare us. When we talk about mythology in the Old Testament, some people freak out and say we're saying it's not true, but I don't know whether they're actually spiritual battles, but it is a way of saying that what goes on in heaven is connected to what goes on in earth, which talks about the spiritual dimension of what we do here on earth. So it is a way of talking about spiritual battles and the spiritual component of what happens to us. Yeah, there are different levels at which we can believe something. Do I believe the actual spiritual battles are taking place? No. Do I think it's a way of talking about the spiritual dimension to the battles that we fight? Yes. That there is an evil to creation beyond what human beings are capable of, is the way that I look at it. And I know that's rather imprecise. I wish it could be more precise. But I take the language of the demonic and the powers and principalities in the New Testament seriously. I don't know exactly what to do with it, but I think there is a spiritual dimension to the evil of the world. Now, certainly the book of Daniel talks about God establishing an eternal kingdom. I think it would be more accurate to say that the New Testament writers saw in that an affirmation of Jesus' ministry. I don't think it's a prediction in the way, say, that like Nostradamus or anything like that. I don't believe that the New Testament, the Old Testament prophets, or even the apocalypticists had any idea that Jesus of Nazareth was coming the first time or the second time. It established the idea that God's will for creation is this eternal kingdom of stability, and in which we are connected to God and to each other, which are divisions, which takes away our divisions. A good place to look at that is in Isaiah 65, the new heaven and the new earth, which was an influential chapter for the New Testament. I think the influence goes the other way, that the New Testament writers read this in the Old Testament and it helped them interpret Jesus coming, but I don't think it was a prediction. You would have various interpretations of the book of Daniel. Certainly, contemporary Judaism affirms a resurrection, which much of the Old Testament did not. I think you would have scholars and people whose opinion of Daniel would not be much different from what you would read in Protestant scholars. But then you would have other people who Jewish who would interpret it different, who might interpret it in similar ways that Christian conservatives interpret it now, really predicting an actual thing that's going to happen. So I think you have a variety of interpretations out there. That is a very interesting question. There's a lot in the Apocrypha, in the intertestamental literature, that brings in some new ideas and some new things. There are a lot of additions to Daniel in the Apocrypha. It is hard to predict how Protestantism would have developed differently if those ideas had been accepted into the canon. That is a question beyond my expertise and my ability to answer it now, but that is a good thing to think about, a good question to ask. If we had more material considered scripture than we do. Now, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, and I think that's why you asked about Protestantism, does give a place to what we consider the Apocrypha. They call it the Deuterocanonical.